So with that, today, Chief Eric Saylors, PhD, is the chief of El Cerrito Kensington Fire Department. He joined the El Cerrito Kensington Fire Department in August 2022, an experienced leader and third-generation firefighter with 27 years in the fire service. He most recently served as the assistant fire chief for the Sacramento Fire Department, managing the EMS division that maintained a $30 million annual budget and responded to over 100,000 incidents a year. Chief Saylors also presented on intentional MCI at the annual MSAC conference in San Diego this year. And his presentation title, as you see, Operational Findings, Intentional Mass Casualty Incidents, very relevant to this tragic reality that we are all living in. So with that, I would just like to introduce Chief Eric Saylors.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. This is a passionate topic of mine, and as you heard, I'm a research doctor, not a real MD, but I do like to take topics like this and explore them, pull them apart, and figure out what we can know through actually testing our methods and procedures. So you're about to hear a story of a 7-year study, a very intentional 7-year study with an intentional design methodology. But people remember stories better than they do simply brief outs or reports. So this story is going to start with a quote, as most good stories do, is from typically accredited to Einstein, but he steals it from somebody else, is if I had 1 hour to save the world, I'd use 50 minutes to define the problem and 10 minutes to find a solution. And this is exactly what the agency we're going to talk about today did, is they spent a lot of time defining the problem before they stumbled across a workable solution. And I do mean that sincerely. 7 years of working through drill after drill to figure out what works and what doesn't work in a very practical world. And you'll find at the end of the presentation, this organization does get tested with a real life event. And the outcomes are very promising for the methodology that they developed through this process. So let's start talking about the 50 minutes that they spent defining this problem. So Sacramento City Fire Department started looking at intentional mass casualty incidents from a perspective of how effective will they be to respond. They put together an actual research team that consisted of a researcher like myself, a few chiefs that were very operationally sound. We were blessed to work with some people that were former combat medics. They were former operators, which meant they were either part of the Green Berets, the SEALs, or the Delta Force, and they were medics on those teams. So they were able to weigh in on a lot of what happens in real life. And we also brought in stakeholders from labor and management to put together this research team to figure out what is the real issues in intense casualties. We did a big literature review. We basically read every after-action review that was out there, and we came to this conclusion that the principle of the problem is time. It is all about time. From the time of injury to the time of surgery, that is your greatest outcome for survivability. And you really see that in the original Vietnam wound analysis published in the 60s that looked at 17,000 soldiers that were wounded in Vietnam. And that became the most objective principle that we measured against, was time. And we had a philosophy that if there was anything that you were doing that was slowing somebody down from injury to surgery, then you were not helping the problem. You were spending critical life. So with that in mind, as they moved forward, they started to develop operational objectives. And they leaned on the documents that they found out there, primarily the Hartford Consensus. And when I mean operational objectives, these were the things that your operators in the field at the tactical level had to achieve in order to meet that principal problem of time. And the Hartford Consensus comes out with a very simple guidance in an acronym called the THREAD acronym. And its guidance tells you the first thing you have to do as an operational objective is suppress the threat. They don't tell you how to do that. They just say, look, the threat has to be suppressed. Next is hemorrhage control, followed by rapid extrication, followed by assessment, and then transport to definitive care. Now, there is some guidance in the hemorrhage control, they're talking about massive hemorrhage control, something that is going to expire the victim in the next 5 minutes. So they're not looking at minor bleeding. They're looking at the thing that is going to cause that victim to die during extrication. There are also some guidance on the assessment. They're not looking at a full primary and secondary. They're talking about rechecking of your tourniquets that may have moved during extrication, or anything that is going to kill that victim in the next few minutes. So a little bit of a shift in the mindset from people like me who have been a street medic since 1994 to this combat philosophy of how quickly can we get hemorrhage control on play, get the person out of the threat environment, or as we like to talk about it in the fire service, IDLH, and get them to a zone where they can be transported to definitive care as fast as possible. You'll notice some things missing from these operational objectives, like triage is not part of this. Any other sort of extra treatment is not part of this. It is stop the bleeding, get them out of the threat zone, assess your bleeding control to make sure it's still in place, and prep them for transport. So these were the operational objectives that we laid down on the series of drills that we ran over 7 years. And there are more than 200 drills that this agency ran to explore what works and what doesn't work. So one of the findings was, as they started these drills, is they had a problem when they started using terminology on the drills on how people understood what was being said. And here were the big things that came out. There was a misunderstanding between the difference between secure, safe, and clear. And we couldn't have a conversation unless we defined those terms. So to clarify it, secure is what we are looking for in an intentional mass casualty incident. We are not looking for safe. Safe is never there. Safe is not something that is attainable. Every after action review is going to show you that typically the scenes are chaotic. Sometimes there is credible threats of secondary devices. We are not looking for safe. We're looking for secure. And the definition of secure is the ability to return effective fire. So we are effectively moving into a zone that has been secured by law enforcement. And finally, the term clear. We're not looking for clear. Technically, clear is a full search of the area and victims. That takes too long. If you're clearing an area, you're going to be spending lives. And clear is not what we want. So we wanted to find some very solid terminology of secure. We're going into secure zones only. We're not going into unsecure zones. And if they become unsecure, we're leaving. Next, the terminology that really made a difference in the mindset of the responders was victim versus patient. So if you're a street medic like myself, you're typically thinking about patient care. Patient care has been embedded in all of your thinking from the beginning, and you have particular protocols that you follow when you are dealing with patients. But we have to delineate here between a patient and a victim. Victims are people that are in a threat zone, in IDLH, that are going to expire in that zone if they don't get removed. And the clarity for a lot of firefighters was that when we come across people inside of burning buildings, they're not patients, they're victims. First, they have to be removed from the IDLH and then into a safety area before they can transition to a patient. Same with drowning victims. We don't get in the water, in swift water, to pull somebody out and treat them like a patient. We don't start asking them questions. We don't do a primary and secondary. We make contact with them and get them out of the IDLH as fast as possible. It is also parallel in trench rescue and confined space rescue. They are victims. When we clarified that to our responders, that when you come across people in these environments, they are victims and they are to be treated as such. They will transition to patients once we get them into an area that we can actually treat them like a patient and we have enough caregivers. The other challenge in this mindset was typically when we respond in the field, we have a ratio of more caregivers to patients. And a lot of these scenarios show you the opposite. You wind up with 4 victims to every 1 caregiver. And at that point, they have to stay victims until you get enough caregivers there. That clarified how people respond on scene. Finally, some of the other definitions were the zones of operation. So in these series of drills, we transitioned off of hot, warm, cold and went back to the original TCCC terminology of threat zones: direct threat, indirect threat, and evacuation zone. Now, I'm sorry to use acronyms like TCCC, but I can explain what that is. If you are looking for the original documentation, it is going to come out of a document called Tactical Casualty Combat Care. TCCC was developed by field medics in combat following the Black Hawk Down event, where they did some after-action reviews and realized that they needed to get better inside of threat zones. So a group of medics and who were operators developed the TCCC document. The TCCC is the beginning of guidance for us on how to operate in threat zones. It gets transferred into TECC, which is Tactical Emergency Combat Care, which is intended for first responders like ourselves who are not in the military. But the original terminology is direct threat, indirect threat, and evac zone. That provides a lot of clarity for our responders, because hot, warm, cold becomes very confusing for people like me, who is a hazmat specialist. And when I hear hot, warm, cold, I think of concentric circles. And I think of physical phenomena, because that's where that terminology came from. Hot, warm, cold builds concentric circles off physical phenomena like a gas leak or a spill that I can model in a computer program. I can develop plumes for it. And there is legitimately a hot zone, a warm zone, and a cold zone. Well, in an IMCI, there is no cold zone. I can't model human behavior like that, and I can't develop plumes. Direct threat and indirect threat draws lines of fire and tells me that I need to go from indirect threat zones to the evac zone. In addition, the hot, warm, cold in other events built some problems. So the Pulse nightclub shooting, there is a discussion of the definition of a hot zone inside that building, while there are roughly 16 people out of the 56 that have been shot that are bleeding out. And the discussion is between law enforcement and fire. The terminology creates a barrier to actual response. In addition, if you look at the Las Vegas shooting, if you use this dogmatically, you'll wind up with a 4-mile hot zone. That's not useful. That's not useful terminology. And it doesn't help us get to our victims. A 4-mile hot zone would technically mean that no EMS personnel is allowed within 4 miles of that event. So we actually backed off and went back to direct threat, indirect threat, and evac zone. And we got much better behavior and understanding of what the operational objectives were on these events. So once we defined our terminology and all of the responders got a clear understanding of what they meant, we started to realize what the real tactical challenges were. So typically we tend to think of access to the victim as being the #1 tactical challenge, but we found out that's typically not it. 50% of your perpetrators are dead within 5 minutes. Many of them commit suicide. It is very hard to find an event that has more than one perpetrator in America. You'll dig your memory and you'll think of Columbine. You'll start to think of San Bernardino, but then you'll start to come up dry because 99% of them are single shooter, single location. One of the tactical challenges that we did come across that was real was hemorrhage control. It is hard to do hemorrhage control in these threat environments when you are dealing with real life victims, and applying tourniquets is not something that street medics do a lot. So it's a tool that we are familiar with, we carry around a lot, but many of us haven't actually applied one in real life. Started a lot of IVs, I've done a lot of mega codes, but I have not put on a lot of tourniquets. And we saw that through our drills. We videotaped most of our drills, and we had a proctor assigned to each victim to record data and to record gaps. And we found that hemorrhage control actually was a gap that we had to fill. So we had to come back and train a lot of our responders on how to properly apply tourniquets. Then we came across the real challenge, which is moving victims. When you use live victims, not mannequins or cardboard cutouts, you actually have full-size adults. You find out that that is the real challenge. If you put 26 of them in a room with a 200-foot move out to an evac zone, your ratios run into problems. You'll find out that a 3-person crew has to do a 3-to-1 carry ratio, which means it takes 3 rescuers to carry 1 victim. You start doing the math and you find out that a 3-person crew can move about 5 victims and then they're tapped out. And we tested them. I have pictures of victims or rescuers having to stop in hallways to take rest after picking up their 5th victim. That was a real challenge. This agency started to experiment and injected what was called a foxtrot, which is basically a drag litter that changes that victim movement ratio 1-to-1. So one victim can drag, or one rescuer can drag one victim out on a foxtrot. That became very effective. And then our ratios changed. A 3-person crew could easily handle 5 victims and gets tapped out at about 10, which makes it easier for the incident commander. If there is a move device in play, if they're dealing with 50 victims, they know they need at least 5 crews in there. If they don't have a move device, they're going to be very slow and they're going to need a lot of people to actually move victims. We found that was the true tactical challenge. The last tactical challenge we came across was sorting victims. So triaging takes way too long. Most of our triage is geared in start RPM, which is designed for a slow-moving MCI, not an MCI where you have 26 people with holes that have been punched into them by a ballistic device. So we transitioned off of triaging into sorting victims, and we used something called the ACE acronym, where we sorted victims in abdominal injuries, then chest injuries, and then extremity injuries. So the abdominal injuries were focused on non-compressible areas. That's something that we as responders couldn't do anything about in this environment. So they were the ones that were transported first, given the choice. After that, it was then chest wounds. Once again, non-compressible for us, but the chest wall buys you some time. And then finally, given the choice, last to go is extremities, because we should be able to put a time frame, a pause on that with a tourniquet. And once we figured out how to sort our victims, we started getting the correct ones to the hospitals in the right order. Non-compressible abdominals, non-compressible chest, and then extremities. And the ACE acronym came into play on most of the later drills as we sorted victims. Those are the tactical challenges that were discovered. Methodology of the study, just briefly, we very intentionally did a mixed method sequential explanatory study. Wow, that is a mouthful. So what that means in non-academic language was we tried something, and if it didn't work, we stopped doing it. We tried something, and if it worked, we did more of it. After every drill, we did a quantitative assessment of all of the times that we recorded, and then we did a qualitative semi-structured interview of everybody that participated in the drill to ask them, what could we have done better? How could we have moved faster? What gear do you want? So over the period of 7 years, we adopted each drill after the successes and failures of the last and slowly fine-tuned our messaging, our terminology, our definitions, and our equipment until we got to the point to where our times transitioned from 45 minutes for the first victim out of a threat zone to, at the slowest, 12 minutes for the last victim out of the threat zone with 26 victims. And we'll talk about some of the outcomes later, but this was the true methodology. The design study was a mixed method sequential explanatory study using quantitative and qualitative data to guide us into our next drill. So the findings after 7 years, the big one that was shocking to us was no more diamond formations. They are just objectively too slow. They were holding us in at 45 minutes. A diamond formation is what's called a diplomatic protection ran backwards. It's from the State Department when they are intended to surround a diplomat and then remove them from a threat zone. The diamond formation was intentionally ran backwards, where you would theoretically get 4 law enforcement officers around your firefighters and bring them into a threat zone. Qualitatively, it was way too logistically heavy to implement, which means it takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of training for firefighters to get into a diamond formation, navigate upstairs, through doors, into any sort of environment that goes into a building. Quantitatively, it was way too slow to form up. We were losing most of our victims from bleed out before a diamond even got in there to start implementing any sort of care. Quantitatively speaking, it lacked an effective exit plan, which meant once you got the firefighters into a room with 26 victims, you had no practical way to get them back out unless you stopped the diamond formation and built a corridor. And qualitatively, it also gave the perception of our firefighters who didn't get a chance to do this often was that they were going into an unsecured area, and we didn't want to give them that perception. When we brought them into any sort of threat zone, we wanted them to know they were going into a secured area. And moving into a diamond formation gave them this perception of, oh, are we going to become part of the contact team? So there's the findings, qualitative and quantitatively, the diamond formation didn't work. The big lean on this was time, because the problem is time. It was objectively too slow. Like I said, we couldn't get past 45 minutes to form up and get in and then get back out. Findings on the ballistic gear. So we did have a research team. We looked at ballistic gear. We did have a lot of people that were on the team that have been shot multiple times, that have multiple Purple Hearts, so they were former combat medics. And when you do the research on your ballistic gear, you find out that they're not bulletproof vests, they're plate carriers. That plate will cover 15% of your body if you are trained to square up on your threat, which means you have to face the threat square shoulder, then that plate covers 15% of your body. If you are caught in a downward position or looking away or flinching or carrying a victim, that plate carrier tends to turn into a ricochet plate, which actually brings the ballistics back into your body. And I have multiple photos of that happening in real life where bullets have come off that plate and then back into the chest wall. They're also a specific type of device that we're not accustomed to wearing or storing. They don't simply get thrown onto a hose bed. They're required to be stored in a certain manner. They have particular ratings, class 1, 2, and 3. Most of us are mimicking what law enforcement wears, which is a class 2, which is designed to stop a 9mm pistol. None of them are going to stop a 5.56 or a 2.23, which is the ballistics that leave an AR-15 style rifle. So when we were looking at this quantitatively, it requires the proper training and the proper body positioning for them to be effective. Any sort of efficacy is reliant on that. We have to know what type of class we're going. If you're going to wear a class 4, which is a rifle class, they're very heavy and cumbersome, and they're going to slow you down. And right backward to the principle of the problem, anything that slows us down is spending lives. You have to store them and size them properly. Once again, it does give the perception of our responders that they're going into an unsecured area. And it's pretty easy to say that we shouldn't be going into an area where we think we're going to get shot anyways. We should be going only into secured areas where there's no chance of that. And we want to get in and out of that area as fast as we can. Qualitatively, there is also a large bit of document on what is called social identity theory. If you study terrorism like I did for many years, you see that many of the terrorists view themselves as the good guy in this event. If you look at, for example, some of the interviews of the Oklahoma City bombing, he actually related himself to Luke Skywalker, and in his mind, he was fighting the evil empire. And with that social identity theory, it tells you a few things: that most of your perpetrators by default do not like law enforcement, but they almost always like fire, which is odd. They relate with fire and they see themselves as similar to fire, where they are the little guy fighting the big problem. So social identity theory, the evidence tells you that you do not want to look like a threat. You don't want to look like any sort of law enforcement officer. You are better off looking like a firefighter in the eyes of most of your perpetrators. So on that qualitative side of ballistic gear, you want to look like a firefighter. That is also very helpful in the fact that most of these events, your biggest threat is other law enforcement officers, blue on blue. They are in gross neurological default. They are high stress, and they can have the tendency to go into tunnel vision, and you want to look like a firefighter if you get out of the secure corridor in some place you don't belong. You do not want to look like somebody who's wearing combat gear but is not on part of their team. So that was the other finding of ballistic gear. No efficacy, almost negative efficacy if you were in the wrong position, and it puts you on the wrong side of social identity theory. We talked about this, but this requires a move device, right? So we ran multiple drills looking at what it takes to move people. 3 years into this process, we truly wanted to test this. So we were running out of buildings that we had acquired in the city to test. But we wanted to do a real life scenario as close as we could. So we actually got a nightclub in the downtown Sacramento area. The owner donated it to us for a Sunday morning. We brought in 56 live victims into this nightclub to mimic the Pulse nightclub shooting. We brought in cold crews. They didn't know that they were going to have a drill. We brought them in that morning and gave them a 5-minute briefing on what was going to happen and told them they were going to hear gunshots in a few minutes. Simply do what we trained them to do. With the move device and 56 people piled into multiple dance floors, 26 of them that were still alive that needed to be extricated, they were on the street in 6 minutes. So I'm going to say that again, because I want everybody to process that. And I'm going to say it specifically. From the time the firefighters broke the threshold, when they were escorted in by law enforcement, they were out on the street with all 26 live victims in 6 minutes. And that was when we knew that we were objectively succeeding, because we had transitioned from 45 minutes from the first victim out to 6 minutes for the last victim coming out to the street with tourniquets on, bleeding control in place, and prepping them for transport in the ACE acronym, abdominal, chest, extremities. But that couldn't have happened unless we had a move device. And right now you're seeing a picture of a Foxtrot. That Foxtrot was actually developed through experimentation on our side. In the beginning of the drills, we let the firefighters use whatever we want. We started off with 17 victims in a threat zone, and we told them, use whatever you want, we'll support it. Try your gurneys. Try your mega movers, try your carryalls, try your backboards. We're here to learn from you. We're going to let firefighters do firefighter stuff, and we're going to watch and we're going to measure everything that you do and then interview you afterwards. And they did. Firefighters are amazing problem solvers. They tried everything from sheets to mega movers to blankets, and objectively, they didn't work until we threw in what is called a sked out of our rescue cache. A sked is a large plastic drag device used for rescues. And it changed how quickly they moved. The sked had challenges, though, as it was very wide and it had a hard time changing and moving corners. So one of our operators, our former combat medics, was watching this ongoing experiment happening, and he looks at that sked and he goes, that's what's called a Foxtrot. We carry that on the bottom of our packs. Most Rangers have it on the bottom of their Apex. I had never heard of a Foxtrot, but I looked it up online. You can buy them for $200. So we bought a few of them. We put them into the drills, and it was a game changer. All of a sudden, our time started to drop drastically. Then we went out and bought 72 of them, put them on every rig, ran another series of drills over 2 more years, got feedback, and everybody said, yeah, part of the feedback was we need another one. So we bought 2 for every rig. And that's when our time started to really move. So I would say you're going to require a move device if you actually get hit with a lot of patients or victims. So sorting versus triage, we already talked about this, but I'll review it again. The ACE acronym, abdominal, chest, extremities, right? This happens in the evac zone, not inside the threat zone. So in the threat zone, it's first come, first serve. You come across somebody, they are either dead or they are alive and coming with you, right? That first come, first serve, it stopped log piles in doorways and choke points. When we initially started this, we tried to do some sort of sorting and triaging in the threat zone. It was too slow, and we wound up a bunch of victims piling up in doorways. When we transitioned to first come, first serve, it cleared the doorways, it got the people out into the evac zone faster, and then they were sorted into ACE, which is abdominal, chest, extremity. Right here, you're seeing a photo of what's called an evac area manager, who is pointing to where the next victim is to go during a drill. We owned a grammar school that we ran a series of drills in every Thursday for a year. And you're seeing a photo of that evac area manager pointing to the firefighters pulling up the next victim. Hey, what do you got? You've got abdominal, you're going over here. What do you got? You got chest, you're going here. You've got extremities, you're going over here. And that way, as the ambulances come in, they know who to take first. One of the challenges of being fast is that we started to get faster than our ambulances showing up on scene. Given 45 minutes, there's plenty of time to organize the ambulances. The challenge was that most of your victims were then at that point dead. But as we were hitting the street in 6 minutes with so many victims, we were faster than our ambulances were showing up on scene. So we would sort them like this so that as the ambulances did roll in, we could get 2 victims off scene very quickly, and we get the right ones, the abdominal victims, non-compressible areas, to definitive care as fast as possible. So the outcomes to the drills, once again, we went from an average of 45 minutes to an average of 11 minutes. Our fastest times were 4 and 6 minutes for 26 live victims with a 200-foot drag. You can see I'm pretty distinct on what I measured on these drills. It was consistent, 26 live victims, 200-foot drags on most of them so that we could have consistent data, right? This was all victims to the hospital in 26 minutes with the ambulances in the downtown core. That was when we knew we were objectively succeeding. So once again, our goal was to get people to definitive care in 45 minutes because the principle of the problem is time. We weren't even getting out of the threat zone in 45 minutes until we started implementing our new procedures. We were getting all victims to the hospital in 26 minutes. So now we get to the real life test of this agency, which is the K Street shooting, and drills were all modeled after real life events, but the K Street shooting came down, and now you're going to hear about this agency's 10 minutes of problem solving versus its 50 minutes of defining the problem. So at 2:05, they get dispatched to the K Street shooting, which is 19 victims spread out over 5 blocks. First engine arrives on scene on 2:08 in the morning, and the scene is secured by 2:07 by CHP. So this is right next to the state capitol. The state capitol has a phenomenal CHP response team. They came out, secured the scene for us immediately. And notice they didn't say cleared, and they didn't say it was safe. They said, no, we've got it secured. We are here. We have the ability to turn effective fire. The bad guy is gone. Bring in the firefighters. So we arrive on scene at 2:08. We establish command. Command recognizes it's a mass killing. We've been training on this for 7 years. He starts to order resources, and he orders the correct amount of resources, which is phenomenal because I've been training on it. And here's the real key is the first victim moves in 12 minutes. So in 12 minutes, they've got the first victim loaded up and moving towards the trauma center. Not 45 minutes, 12. Last victim is off scene in 34 minutes. Headed towards the trauma center. Now, this was something a little bit harder than what we trained for because this was 19 victims spread out over 5 blocks. This wasn't 19 victims in a small box, but still the training kicked into play. Now, I co-presented this in San Diego with my partner in crime on this, Dr. Mackey. Dr. Mackey is a real doctor. He's been our medical coordinator there for years. He's a phenomenal person to work with. And one of the keys to this was that everyone got in an ambulance. Everybody that got in an ambulance survived. And we did a full after action review on this, and the qualitative data, these were some of the responses from the semi-structured interviews. So we did a survey on everybody that was on scene, doing what's called a KMO gap analysis, if there was gaps in their knowledge and their motivation and their organizational support. We also did a qualitative semi-structured interview on everybody that was on scene, got them all transcribed, plugged it into a giant AAR, and here's some of your responses. You say, as an organization, we had gone through intentional MCI training, which meant from the battalion chief rank all the way down to the transporting paramedics. Everybody understood what the objective is, to get the patients to the hospital quickly, stop the bleeding, transport them to a trauma center, and get them to a surgeon. So this is a direct quote from one of the people that were interviewed that said, yeah, I knew exactly what my operational objectives were. And even when I went into gross neurological default and was stressed out beyond anything I could ever imagine, I remembered, stop the bleeding, get the victim to the trauma center, right? And then the final quote, those basic objectives directly related to the intentional MCI training that we had received. It's a major change in the mindset in the fire department over the last 5 to 10 years. So that was the qualitative data that we saw. Quantitative data, we were very fast. And finally, when we looked at the operational outcomes of the victims that were transported, they were all gunshot wounds, all major trauma. Everyone that got in an ambulance survived. And Dr. Mackey and I ran this counterfactual as we looked at this, and we said, if we had gone into a diamond formation, nobody would have been transported because they all would have been dead by the time we got there. If we had ran a traditional MCI and laid out the tarps and started triaging, nobody would have been transported because they all would have died on the tarps before we started to move them. And that was the counterfactual that proved that these operational outcomes needed to be shared with other agencies and spread with the understanding that this is simply an evolution of how we manage these events, and we need to have clarity on the difference between a slow-moving MCI and a fast-moving MCI. A slow-moving MCI is a thing that we're used to seeing, which is a rolled over bus or a derailed train where you can have a high number of victims, but they are not typically, critical trauma victims. Whereas a slow-moving or a fast-moving MCI, where you have your shootings or your bombings, is that you typically have 20 to 30 critical trauma patients that need to be moved to definitive care as fast as possible. And you have to know what your operational objectives are to make that happen. Because if you don't understand that time is the principle of the problem, you will be spending lives, the victims' lives, by doing non-critical functions, like pulling out triage tags or going into diamond formations. So that is the end of the presentation, and I want to thank everybody who was willing to listen to this from a pracademic like myself, who is an academic but also a practitioner. And just to remind you, in these events, time is everything.
You Saylors, thank you so much, and don't go away because I'm sure there's going to be questions. And so while people are putting some questions in the chat bar, I just want to thank you. That's I've got two questions just to start it off.
Yeah.
The first being in that when you actually get the victim out quickly and get them into the ACE categories and you've beat the ambulance, what are the very next things that you're encouraging people to do, whether it's IV access or just reassess, et cetera? And then my second question really is, how fast are these findings being spread across the country in EMS and fire?
So first question, it depends on the amount of caregivers that you have. And these practical drills, we put almost all effort of people on scene into going in and removing the victims. So they would move into a secured corridor in what's called a rescue strike team. And their primary job was to get the victims and themselves out of the threat zone. They tend to want to run in waves, which means they would go in and say, 12 to 20 firefighters are going to strike team. They would remove the victims and they'd hit the street, and then a wave of firefighters would come out that no longer needed to extract victims. And then we would try and transition them into patient care, right? And we would move from tourniquets to chest seals to the things that were going to kill them. We avoided IV access or things that we didn't have a lot of equipment with, because equipment is a challenge at that point, right? We typically carry an EKG monitor and an ALS bag for one victim. You lay 26 of them out, well, now you're running into problems. So we stocked up on chest seals, quick clot, and tourniquets so that we could control that. Does that make sense? Oh, I think you're muted. So then I'll address your second.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Your second question was, how quickly is this being rolled out to the nation? So holding this in the incubator as long as we could. We did the first few years without telling anybody because we wanted to make sure our findings were solid. I have done a presentation like this for the Center of Homeland Defense and Security. You're seeing most federal responders acknowledging it and transitioning to a secure corridor like this and adopting the terminology. I was recently interviewed for a podcast called The Weekly Scrap, And that had a big splash across the nation. I get contacted 2 or 3 times a week by fire chiefs across the nation asking questions about details on what type of standard operating guidelines look like and how do they evolve into this type of tactic. With that understanding, as I'll say humbly, this is simply an evolution, right? By no means is this the end all be all. This is just getting better at this problem, and I'm hoping somebody else will study it more and even push it further. So it is slowly trickling out across the nation. That podcast had a huge impact, and you're finding that most people that have had an event like this acknowledge that the standard practices that are in place don't practically work, right? From triage tags to triaging to diamond formation, and even the acknowledgement of ballistic gear. Most people hadn't thought about it clearly enough to come to the conclusion of, oh yeah, you're right. That really doesn't make sense. Why am I wearing a plate carrier that I have to square up on the perpetrator for it to cover 50% of my body? It's much safer for my firefighters to get in and out of that threat zone in 6 minutes than it is to leave them in there for 45 as they try and stumble with a bunch of equipment and gear that they're not familiar with.
Got it. Yeah, great. Next question comes from NorCal medic and Care Flight medic Mark Thomas. He first of all said, "Thank you very much. How well does this translate to our long 2+ hour transport times in rural areas, to a trauma center with minimal resources?"
Yeah, as time is the principle of the problem, if you've got a 2-hour transport, that is going to be very hard on the victim, but it's going to be even harder if it's 2 hours plus 45 minutes. So said in another way, the sooner I start that long transport, the more likely my survival is for the victim. So I acknowledge that this was done in an urban environment, and I acknowledge that there's a lot of places that are going to have a challenge for this. And I'm probably going to be doing a drill down in the Hollister area at the beginning of next year where they face those challenges. But it is still the same of, you don't want to add extrication time onto the transport time to go from 2 hours to 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Any other questions out there? I don't see them typed in. It was a very clear presentation.
I'd like to know, this is Larry Masterman from Trinity County. I'd like to know where and how we can learn more about this.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic, and I am open to anybody contacting me. I can make my personal email available. You can also look me up on Facebook or LinkedIn. I'm very good about getting back to you. I can share some draft SOGs with you. Yeah. And I, like I said, I get contacted 2 or 3 times a week to share the information.
Hi, Mr. Saylor.
Yeah.
This is District 5 Supervisor Jason Ingram here in Lassen County. I'm also a volunteer with Doyle Fire Protection District for the last 7 years. I was just wondering, in our case, are foxtrots already available in Lassen County for a mass shooting incident? And we are unique and not a very populated county, but is this going to be nationwide with the foxtrots on board everywhere for first responders, and everybody would know the new lingo as far as the hot and cold not being a part of it? We have our threat zone, our evacuation zone, and our indirect threat zone. I was just wondering if everybody was on board with this, and if the foxtrots are available for Lassen County specifically.
So I'll address the foxtrot. That's up to the agency to purchase. That was the best solution we could find through the drills. So I make that as a recommendation. How to do that practically, we purchased them out of our EMS budget in Sacramento. In the new fire department I'm in, I used a SHISCAP grant to buy them for every agency in the county. I should say every unit in the county, right? So Contra Costa County is going to be getting 2 foxtrots for every unit in the county. And I would suggest Lassen could probably pursue that as well if you have any SHISCAP grants coming up. They're about $200 a piece, but it is something you have to purchase yourself. Most of the agencies that reach out to me when they see pieces of this presentation or they listen to the podcast that I was interviewed on, they'll go out and they'll buy the foxtrots. And one of the things that frees up that budget is if you're not spending $2.5 million on ballistic gear, you have a lot more money to spend on a very inexpensive foxtrot, which actually has some efficacy and some patient outcome. Now, to the next question of the transition to the terminology. There are not a lot of official documents that guide that terminology. For the fire service, the most prominent one is the Asher 3000, which is a document out of NFPA. And you will typically see hot, warm, cold next to direct threat, indirect threat, and evac zone in brackets, because the direct threat and indirect threat was the original terminology. So we are just going back to literally what was used originally and removing the hot, warm, cold as the hazmat metaphor. So it's how long that takes to spread across the country, I'm not quite sure. But I can say that it is, if you are running a drill, it will be much more effective for your responders to understand what those terms mean. And it's not going to hurt anybody's feelings if somebody uses hot, warm, cold on an incident. Just don't get in an argument over what it means. You can just revert back to, no, direct threat means that we don't go in the line of fire. Indirect threat means that we're not in line of fire, but we're in a security area and we got some victims to get. Evac zone is where we're headed. There is no cold zone on any of these events. So I hope that answered that question clearly.
It did. Thank you very much. I went ahead and sent my personal email in chat form. If you can send me the information, the name of the grant, and any kind of information on that, I'll go ahead and look into it for us.
Okay.
Dr. Keppel, can you hear me? This is Donna Stone.
I can, Donna.
Okay, we do have some other questions that have come in on our end.
Oh, okay.
Marcus Hurt asked, he said, great presentation. How do obstructions, for instance, stairs, affect patient movement with a device? All data is pertaining to single level structures, right?
That's incorrect. All of that is not related to single structure. We did bring in stairs. So how we escalated through our drills was we started with things that were objectively simple. The first phase that we went through was Charlottesville vehicle into a crowd. We then progressed to Sandy Hook and then to the Pulse nightclub. Then we got into scenarios that were much more difficult, specifically the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, which is a two-story gunfight. And Sacramento had access to what is known as Tactical Village, which is where the law enforcement agencies train. And we did run through a two-story building for a year. So for a year, we ran these scenarios with Cole firefighters. The Foxtrot worked okay on the stairs, much better than no Foxtrot. And we developed this saying as a little bit of a joke, is that the Foxtrot sucks. The only thing that sucks more than the Foxtrot is not having one. So the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting does present you with some problems upstairs. We did do that. One of the most significant problems is an officer that gets shot high in the arm and almost bleeds out without a tourniquet. And the stairs, the Foxtrot does work on the stairs, and we did implement on multiple stories in a few drills. So that's the answer to the stairs and the multi-levels. I don't know what your better alternative is in stairs. Bringing in stair chairs seems like a good idea until you realize you need 30 of them. And I have evacuated high-rise buildings, 12-story buildings with multiple hundreds of people in them. We brought everybody down in stair chairs, but that was not people that were bleeding to death. So the Foxtrot so far is the best tool I've seen for mass downstairs. I hope that answers that question clearly.
There may be one other, it's a comment, you might have addressed this, Dr. Saylors. Is the ACE method peer reviewed? And that was from Chad Lewis.
So the ACE method was developed with our medical directors and our disaster control facility. And it's a great question, is it peer reviewed? Because I can say not yet. I haven't got a chance to publish this study because I was writing my dissertation, and the dissertation was 4 years of hard work. My focus in my doctorate is risk assessment. And now that I'm taking a rest off that, I'm going back to this document to have it published, and it'll probably be published in the Journal for Homeland Security. But the ACE acronym was developed with our medical director, both state, local, and our disaster control facility, when we asked them, who do you need first? Who needs to go to surgery first, right? So it's kind of an obvious answer when you reverse engineer and look at it and go, oh yeah, The people that we can't do anything for, non-compressible abdominal wounds, they need to go.
Mhm. Yeah. And were you able to get something qualitative or quantitative about those? I think you said 19 survivors on K Street that were taken in terms of would they have died with a certain amount of time elapsing?
Yeah, that was looking at the victims and using Dr. Mackey as my SME. All of those were major trauma, and the conclusion was none of them would have survived if they hadn't got there in time. And that was the counterfactual we ran against the K Street. And it was an enlightening study to look at, to realize everyone that got in an ambulance survived, and they were all off scene very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Covered all that ground and questions and still have 5 minutes to spare. That's not bad. Time is everything. Okay.
Principle of the problem.
That's right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Chief Eric Saylors, and also thank everybody for joining us. And we encourage many of you to come to our April conference. And so thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.